Okay, it's here we are, part two. So we're going to pick up where we left off, and we've so far been discussing emotion and prejudice. We've been referring heavily to Allport. We've been investigating the difference between discrimination, prejudice, and stereotypes. Three different terms, related, but necessarily different, and hopefully we've gotten that clear. So let's talk about emotion and prejudice then, and let's talk about sources of variability. That emotions can be aroused outside of awareness, and emotions are linked to prejudice and stereotypes. Now, obviously when we talked about research, I was making a case for non-conscious emotions. Other people might not agree with that, but notice that the factors that instigate emotional experience have been demonstrated to be clearly both conscious and potentially non-conscious in that respect. Penelope's here with us. She's kind of chilled out now, relaxing. All the windows in the house are open because it's a nice day, so that makes the cats crazy, but now they're all kind of tired and sleeping, storing up their energy to go to berserk a little later. Hi, Penelope. Yeah, sweetie. So, emotions can be aroused outside. They can be linked to prejudices and stereotypes. And when we saw emotion action tendencies, we saw the functionality of that. So, emotions motivate behavior, and in teaching both psych of emotion and psych of motivation, sometimes I find myself walking down a very strange path in between the two ideas. Where does one end and where does one begin? And definitions of motivation vary, definitions of emotion vary. Of course, you know that because that's going to be your final exam question is, what is your definition of emotion and how did you come to that? And remember, that's the important part. How did you come to it? You have to refer to course material to do well on that question. Theoretically. But emotions do motivate behavior. Like I said, emotions are for doing. Action tendencies, of course, are an example of that, as we discussed last time. Different people, right, can experience different emotions in response to the same person or same group. So there's a huge amount of variability in the personal experience and expression of emotions. And note that emotions can vary tremendously in their intensity from one person to the next. So lots of variability, and those are some of the potential sources. And we often see logic or reason, and we've talked about many philosophers who went back and talked about the role of reason in regulating emotions, all the way back to Confucius and Aristotle, if you will. So, three categories of emotion within the group context then, since we're talking prejudice and discrimination is often discussed at a group level. There are intergroup emotions, and this is often a function of power dynamics. Image theory seeks to explain this at a macro level, and image theory is looking at the narrative of a group, of power differentials and consistency of goals, and then determining what the relationship between two countries might be, two political entities might be, on the basis of the stories that each tells about the other and the emotions that are generated. For example, if we have an adversary, right, who is much stronger than us, then perhaps the logical emotion would be fear. That is, because they are more powerful than us, we may in fact fear them and attempt to avoid encountering them in negotiations, right? If we feel that we're of equal power and we have goal incompatibility, right, then we may in fact aggress towards those people, and anger might be the emotion for in large part that we experience. So we can analyze those relationships at the intergroup level. Now, intergroup anxiety is often a result of perceived resource allocation challenges. So we feel that in fact we become anxious because we feel this other group maybe prevents us from acquiring something that we need. And Sharif and Sharif talked about realistic conflict theory, and they built their theory on the basis of intergroup competition for what are perceived or are actually limited resources. And it can also be the result of perceived loss of culture or morality. And we see often that white separatists, for example, want to keep themselves separate. They want to stay whole, right, as whites, and not allow the influx of other ideas and other cultures which could contaminate their life. So And notice a white supremacist doesn't necessarily feel that whites are superior. They may or may not, but they want to remain separate so that they're not contaminated by outside influences. And then empathy. In this context, it can be a potential moderator of intergroup emotions, especially fear and anxiety. So to the extent that we learn about others, and not just learn about them, but then come to feel the world in the way they feel it, that is, we learn to empathize, then it really diminishes the effects of anxiety and or fear. Right, Penelope? Yeah, sweetie. Both Penelope and her sister Annika do a lot of silent meowing. They don't make a lot of noise yet. And did you know that cats, when they live together, all have distinctive meows? So it's interesting to watch kittens come into a household full of cats and what meow they eventually choose as their method of communication. And for most people, a lot of people then theorize that meowing is really a cat-human form of communication. And you don't hear cats meow a lot at each other. They may growl, they may hiss, they may do other things, but meowing is usually reserved for the human and feline relationship. So, general model then of intergroup anxiety as we were talking about it. Well, let's begin down here, and what we see is we have a categorization. Oops, this is not even in slideshow mode. What's going on there? That doesn't look very good. I'm sorry, guys. That looks a little better. Okay. So, categorization of a person as an outgroup member, that is, they're not of my group. And what do we see possible then? Well, the activation of negative stereotypes of the outgroup. So I encounter an outgroup member and I say, oh, those people, right? Or, oh, that group, right? So the negative stereotypes. Now, what else is going on that contributes to this process? Well, there's little prior contact with the outgroup. That is, we might not have much knowledge. So if that's part of the case, or if we've had contact but it's been negative, note then that all three factors can lead to negative expectations for the outcome of the intergroup interaction. And notice how this dovetails with anxiety. If I expect the interaction not to go well, then prior to the interaction, I become anxious by the fact that I believe it's not going to go well. All right? So the negative expectations of outgroup interaction, right, then lead to this intergroup anxiety, this thought that it's not going to go well, and that might lead me to then avoid. And we can see anxiety is probably an avoidant type emotion. And intergroup anxiety can also then lead to prejudice, prejudging people. Because remember, we don't like anxiety. Anxiety is related to uncertainty. So the prejudice or prejudging, that is operating according to preconceived notions, right, then makes us feel safer and perhaps less anxious because we are in effect making our world more predictable. Right, sweetie? Yeah. Okay. So, intergroup anxiety correlates in opportunity. Very robust, strong correlation between intergroup anxiety and prejudice and negative group attitudes. So this anxiousness. And we saw this again when we were researching white supremacists and white separatists. They're anxious, and and remember the relationship of fear to anger I discussed as well. They're afraid that they may lose something, that their culture becomes diminished, that their blood is no longer pure, that their resources have to be shared with people who are not entitled to those resources based on their group membership, right? And this then develops the negative group attitudes. These people are taking things from us. These people are preventing us to living from the way we want. And this is a story that Hitler told. He said, look at Germany. Here we are in this depression. There's no work. We have rampant inflation. And of course, the scapegoating process is the anxiety that you're feeling, the uncertainty about your future. Well, this is the result of the Jews and their power and their ability to control what happens. So we have to counter this, right? And that's how the negative group attitudes are reinforced, and people actually effectively then become less anxious, and they become angry because they believe they're entitled, and this other group is preventing them from what they believe they're entitled to, so anger is kind of laced in with the anxiety. Intergroup anxiety appears to be self-reinforcing. It promotes behaviors that keep the anxiety operating. And one thing that astounded me by researching, especially websites, is the constant retelling of the same story over and over again. Yeah, the detailed context in which this story occurs changes, but the theme, the narrative is consistent. Just a new example to reinforce that narrative, right? And this then serves to increase one's level of prejudice and justify increasing those levels of prejudice. But this leads to greater anxiety because the threat then becomes more omnipotent. It becomes more consistent in a person's mind, and it becomes more the way they view the world, right, as us necessarily against them. So one potential advantage for reduction is the support in the way these mechanisms work both ways, though. If we can diminish the anxiety, that is, then we see the other features begin to diminish as well. Less anxiety, less anger. Less anxiety, less uncertainty. So it is undoable. And I don't know if you want to liken this to the amygdala, having a lot of projections moving away from the amygdala and very few projections back to the amygdala. Maybe it's not so sad a story as that in fact there's a lot of opportunities to turn this around. So let's use this quote: empathy is walking a mile in somebody else's moccasins. Sympathy is being sorry for their feet hurt. And so empathy and sympathy, obviously two different things, and we're typically talking about growing empathy here. So emotions towards immigrants. The emotions of home students are complicated, Sturmer found in this study. There's an empathic impulse that might be strong impulse, but there's also other emotions. So we have mixed emotions occurring in folks. He says the insecurity, intergroup anxiety, concerns about behaving correctly, offering the appropriate kind of help are often difficult. Psychologists who have studied ethnic-based prejudice in the United States found something similar. Because white people fear their own missteps, right, then they often hesitate to interact with black people. Instead, whites stay away, even avoiding eye contact, for fear of somehow doing the wrong thing. And obviously, that's no reason not to attempt to do the right thing, for fear of doing the wrong thing. But we have to learn to kind of face the anxiety and move forward. And at the basis of this is through the development of empathy. Now here's a cool book. This is Empathy, a Social Psychological Approach. You shouldn't be kind of surprised that I'm offering you a social psychological approach, because obviously I am a social psychologist. This book by Mark Davis, I love this book. I think it's a great explanation of empathy and a great exploration of the ideas of empathy. And what we have is Mark Davis's attempt at a definition, and what we'll see after that then is an honest-to-God Davis empathy scale where we can measure our own empathy. So let me read Davis's intro here. I have a confession to make. After studying empathy in one form or another for over 15 years, I'm finally beginning to feel as though I have some understanding of the topic. Part of the reason it's taken so long, I fear, is dispositional as they are. No doubt many others are quicker studies than I. Yeah, okay. But some of the reasons also lie in the nature of the topic itself. Empathy is a multifaceted phenomenon of interest to psychologists of many different stripes. And notice that there's clinicians, developmental, sociologists, sociobiological, personality, social psychologists, right? As well as a variety of non-psychologists. And this would include anthropologists, philosophers, theologians. In my defense, I would suggest that one reason it's difficult to get a good handle on empathy is because it has too many handles. And for those of us who like to study slippery concepts, this is kind of a common experience. In my studies and working with some students on the study of predation, right? You think, well, predation, that's a simple construct. But once you really start to explore predation and predatory behavior, it too becomes multifaceted and difficult to pin down. So Davis, in his 15 years, which is much longer than 15 years now, maybe talking 25 years, if we look at this idea in looking, and there's a website here, so the culture of empathy, etc. You can check out Davis's work online, and you can find the empathy test online. He's got 4 subscales within his large empathy test, and it's explained in the book quite well, and the actual quizzes in the book, but I'm sure you can find it online as well, the actual survey instrument. So perspective taking is one component. How is that defined? The perspective, the PT scale, measures reported tendency to spontaneously adopt the psychological point of view of others in everyday life. And here's an example question. I sometimes try to understand my friends better by imagining how things look from their perspective. So one component then, according to Davis, of empathy is the ability, not only the ability, but the motivation to take another's perspective. Now, the second construct, or subconstruct if you will, is the empathic concern scale. Assesses the tendency to experience feelings of sympathy and compassion for unfortunate others. So to what extent do we actually then put ourselves in their place, not cognitively like in perspective taking, but feel what they're feeling, and this would be empathic concerns. And this is the sample question. I often have tender concerned feelings for people less fortunate than me. And to the extent that that actually has a visceral, creates a visceral response in you. The personal distress is, again, also with this kind of visceral response, taps a tendency to experience distress and discomfort in response to extreme distress in others. And this human quality varies among people, right? For many of us, to see someone hurt, in fact, causes us a similar pain that we internalize their pain. So this would be how personally distressed do we become distressed at the experience of another. Now notice, for bullies, right, for malignant narcissists, if you will, for people in this, they actually enjoy observing distress in others. So this would be a component of sadism, if you would, and you know, the dark triad, which was what, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, psychopathy, Machiavellianism. I'm forgetting the third, but then had the dark tetrad had the sadism included in the idea. Okay? And then the fantasy scale measures the tendency to imaginatively transpose oneself into fictional situations. And here, when I'm reading an interesting story or novel, I imagine how I'd feel if the events in the story were happening to me, to what extent you get swept up in a story. Or it could be a movie or a television show where you actually experientially enter into the mode of the character. Okay? So this is a great study of empathy, and it gives us the 4 subscales and gives us an idea of that multifaceted discovery that Mark Davis has made over the years. So let's relate empathy to prejudice then. And what we see then is negatively correlated with several forms of prejudice. Right? So that is, to the extent that we're empathic, then we're less likely to be prejudiced in that regard. It's negatively correlated with prejudice against African Americans, according to Whiteley and Wilkinson. According to Batson, Chang, or Rowland, empathy affects prejudice in 3 ways. So adopting the perspective of a stigmatized group leads to increase in empathic feelings. Empathetic feelings prompt greater valuing of the other person's welfare. And if individuals' group membership is a salient component of empathy-inducing situation, then increased valuing can lead to more positive attitudes towards that group. So if we think in terms of Guatemalans and we say, oh, look at the Guatemalans, Guatemala can be a dangerous place to live. There's a lot of the drug war manifesting itself. It can be dangerous, and many times people say, look, this is no place to raise my kids, there's no future here, I got to get the hell out of here. And they take the risk, they move northward, they go through Mexico where they're not welcome, right? And then they try to come into the United States, and we build up a wall to keep them the hell out. And really, what are these people about? They're about trying to make a better world for their children, and they don't believe it's possible in their home country in Guatemala. So they do the next best thing. They take this tremendous risk to try and go somewhere else where they believe they'll have a better shot at building a better life. Now, obviously, I'm discussing this as someone who's really relatively empathetic to their situation, right? Others will not experience that empathy, and they will voice different philosophies about what should be done in this case. But it really relates to empathy and how it relates to prejudice. So let's leave empathy behind. Let's talk a little bit about stereotypes and moods as we go. I'll tell you what, I'm going to break here and we'll start at part 3 because it's kind of a natural place to do this. So hang on.